Hello. Is everybody remote today, or are you in the class?
I'm home.
Okay. Let's give it about 5 minutes, then we can start. So I'm going to drop a couple links into the Slack. So let's just give it 1 more minute, and we can get started.
Hi, Jake.
Hi. Just waiting for a quorum.
Yeah, no worries.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, who's here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Let's see who's missing. I think we're missing a couple.
Quay and Kelly.
Hmm.
Quay, Kelly. Is Beth's here, so.
Okay.
I have to think around the room how everybody sits.
We'll give it 1 more minute, and we'll get started.
I know Alice is on.
It looks like Jaquay, Anna, and Dakir just left.
Oh. Hopefully they'll come back on quickly.
Kate, I like the questions on your pup quiz.
Oh, thanks.
I would definitely just end up with a mutt, like I always do, pretty much.
Yeah, I had that error yesterday, and I was thinking about making it like if you receive an error back, you're like a cat person or something like that instead.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Just to make it fun.
My two are sleeping peacefully, but I'm sure they'll erupt in a moment, and I'll mute.
Yeah, my dog's just staring at me. Like I know you're home, so why aren't we doing anything?
Right.
Well, I think we should probably get started. So yesterday was a lot of theory, and the rest of the week is going to be a lot of practice. Just kind of like practical, hands-on, workshop-oriented stuff, not too much theory. But hopefully we'll get to apply some of what we encountered in yesterday's lesson. So the way I'm going to try to orient this is about 50% hands-on working with React, like developing React-based applications, because you guys just started that up last week, and probably you're going to use some React in your applications. And I know a lot of you are sort of have functional HTML prototypes, and you're sort of like trying to figure out how to turn those into React applications. So it'll be about 50% just like hands-on React development, so that you get some more practice with that. And then 50% testing, like how to test those React applications using different kind of techniques, some specifically related to React, and then some that can be generally applied toward web application development, just in general. So so I'll start with actually, today let's do it in reverse. Let's start with the lab content, and we can start like building a simple React application in the lab. And then after that, we can transition to some lecture content on testing the application that we just built. And then we can do some lab work around that testing. So we're going to try to use REPL.it again. I prepared a lab for us to do, and I've just been trying to get it running in REPL.it, and I'm having a little bit of trouble with it. So I think we should start with REPL.it and see if we can get it to work. But if it doesn't work, then we'll have to switch to something else. But anyway, I dropped in a link to REPL.it in CIC students. So if you want to join me there, we can get started. Let me know if you have trouble finding the link. So I remember one of I think it was it Ava, or sorry, is it Ava or Eva?
Eva.
Eva. Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. So I think you were working on. Were you working on the migraine application?
No, that was Beth.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. But you're talking about integrating with weather APIs.
That was
Oh yeah, Elizabeth. Yeah. And so I was thinking that we could like build a simple weather app in React that would use some of those APIs, and that would be a good way to get started. And so the thing about weather APIs is that most of them are not free, but there's actually one API which is free to use, which is a really good one. It's published by NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. It's a government agency, And they have weather stations all over the country. And they publish all of their data for free. They have a whole bunch of different APIs that you can use. I don't know if specifically they have one related to that'll capture barometric pressure, but they do have forecast APIs. And potentially they have, I think maybe their individual weather station, like they have, you can basically capture not quite real time, but near real time data from their individual weather stations. And I'm pretty sure that those publish barometric pressure. So maybe between those two. So anyway, I was thinking we could build a simple weather application that pulls down some weather data and puts it into like a little widget inside of a web page. So, I've built an example of that and posted it online, all the code for today. But I figured we could work on this collectively, interactively. We could build this application. So let's see who's joined me in the multiplayer mode. Oh, looks like I need to start the session. Sorry about that. Okay, I'm gonna post it here in zoom.us, the zoom.us chat. I'll also post it in Slack. Okay, I just put it in both places. Great. So you guys already saw how to use Create React app to set up a new React.js project. So that's basically what REPL.it has done for us, is set up this project. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay, great. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is I'm gonna show you how to look up some documentation on the API that you're interested in. So for us, we're interested in the NOAA Weather API. So you can see here, weather.gov, they have an API web service. And they have all these different formats and an endpoint and some examples of how you actually use this API. So for example, says, how do I discover the weather using this API? They give you an example. This API is not authenticated, so you don't need an account key to use it, which is rather unusual for APIs. Usually, in order to limit how much you're basically in order to meter the traffic, most APIs require you to have an account key, but this one doesn't. It's just open for anybody to use. So, so you can take that URL that they gave you as an example and plug it into your web browser, and you can start to take a look at it and read it to figure out what services are available to you. So we can see here that they have some metadata in the JSON response. Just taking a look at it, it looks like this is just like a description of the type of data that it might give back to you. A lot of stuff related to GeoJSON, which is a format for telling you about not just geometry, but like the location of like location data. And then you can see here under properties, it has a bunch of interesting stuff. So it has some URLs related to forecasts, different forecasts, an hourly forecast, and a number of observation stations related to this, to the latitude and longitude that we passed in. And some information about the location that we gave it. So it was able to identify the city and state related to that latitude and longitude, and bearing, apparently. And then it looks like it has a number of zones, forecast zones. I'm not quite sure what those are. And then a time zone and a short identifier for a radar station. So we can drill down even further by visiting these URLs. And for the forecast, we can see, for example, that it has like a number of periods. Looks like 14 different periods related to things like, you know, Monday night. So this is a forecast that lasts multiple days. And then for each one of those periods, it has things like the forecasted temperature, the wind speed and direction, an icon related to that forecast. We can see what that looks like. So a nice handy icon for us to display. And then some detailed descriptive text of that forecast. And then you can go in and take a look at the observation stations. And you can see what weather stations are nearby. And I think if you plug this in, it might give you some detailed information. No, it looks like it's just giving the forecast. I thought there was a way to get more detailed data from individual stations, but might have to go back and look that up later. But anyway, so you can start to see how the data is structured from this particular API. And so we can start to use that to build like a little forecast, a weather forecast widget that basically reads our current location and then uses that to look up the forecast for our current location and then displays it nicely in the browser. Yeah, so so now that we're all here in the REPL.IT, we can start to build this stuff out. So to get started, we probably want to use that API, and I'll post these APIs, these links in the chat. So we probably want to use this API in order to look up some data, in order to fetch some data. So does anybody remember how to fetch data into the web browser? There are like two ways to do it. So so given a URL, and you want to connect to some JSON web service at that URL, what's the best way to fetch that?
Wouldn't you just use fetch?
Yeah, totally. So do you want to write that out? Yeah. Yeah, let me post into the chat the URLs. I can figure out how to access the chat. There. Cool. Yeah. So what is fetch? So that looks good. What is fetch return? So by default, fetch is going to use a get. So you don't need to specify it explicitly. So how do you handle the fetch response? Right. And that's because, and why is that? Like what is fetch returning?
Are you asking if it's like just returning like JSON?
Yeah, well, the response is JSON, but when you're calling the fetch function, what is it? What's the name of the class that it's returning?
Oh,
What? Yeah. What has the property dot then?
oh, the
Are you asking because it's asynchronous?
Oh, I'm just asking to make sure that.
app, like,
So fetch returns an object, and that object represents some future value that that you're going to get back.
right.
And what's the name of the object that it's returning? What kind of an object is it?
Is that a promise?
Yeah, it's a promise, exactly. Yeah. So okay, cool. So you call fetch, and then it returns a promise, and then you can do fetch.then, and then you want to receive the response back. So does anybody want to write that that handler function to process the response? Cool. Yeah, now for this, you would need to know the fetch API. You can keep going. Yep. Yeah, perfect. You gotta make that a function call. So an invoke.json. Great. Yeah. Okay. And what is response.json return?
Won't that return everything in an object?
Yeah, it will, but response.json also returns a promise. But if you return a promise in the handler function to your promise, then it'll wait for that promise to resolve before going on to the next function. So yeah, you're doing it right. So keep going, keep going. Yeah, so if you want to continue to Yeah, definitely. Oh.
No, we're gonna. I don't
Yeah.
know. What are we calling it? I mean,
I mean, when I don't know what to call something, I just usually call it O, like a small O for object,
okay.
which is maybe not the best thing, but you know, saves me from having to think about it. But you could call it O, or yeah, that's so.
And then we have this.
Yeah, and yeah, and you can just console.log that to make sure that it's working correctly. Yeah.
What are we just console logging O?
Yeah. Just to make sure that we're able to get that that result out. Okay, so this is not actually going to show us anything on the page. We'd actually have to like navigate to the page and open up the debugging console to make sure that it's working.
Mm-hmm.
If we want to actually see something quickly in the page, then I can just do an alert json.stringify O and format it. And then it'll refresh the page and it should give us an alert. Oh, except it probably suppressed alert boxes. Oh, well. It doesn't do it if you're in an iframe. Okay, so anyway. Oh, no, there, it actually did the thing. So you probably got an alert box on the page. So we can see what, so this is just different ways to verify that we're getting back what we were expecting to get back. So, okay, cool. So we're getting data now that we can use. We probably don't want to fetch this data in our render function because the render function is going to get called, well, right now it's only going to get called once. So but we probably want to move this logic outside of the render function into a different spot. So does anybody, I'm not sure how far into like, did you guys study component life cycles last week when you were learning about React? Did you get to?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, we did that with the last day of last week, Thursday.
Okay, super. That's really handy. So given that, do you have an idea of where it would make sense to put, you know, a function that fetches data into your, you know, so you're creating, so your component gets newly created, right? And you want that newly created function, you want it to be able to fetch some data and then pull the data in and then update its state. And then it's going to take that state that's been updated and it's going to call the render function again, and then you can render that updated state. So where do you think where would it make sense to put that logic that fetches the data when the component is first created?
Would you put it in the updating stage, like after it already renders? After the mounting, after mount or before?
You could do it before it mounts. Yeah, that would work. You could put it there. You could put it after it mounts. That's also fine, because both of those are only going to get called once, before mount and after mount. So those are both good places to put it. You could also, there's one other place that you could put it, which is the constructor. because in JavaScript, every class has a special method called constructor, and the constructor gets the constructor gets called whenever the class is instantiated. So whenever you basically are creating a new copy of that class, or what's called a new instance of that class, it calls this special method called constructor, and that also only gets called once in a class's life cycle. So you could put it into any of those spots. Would anybody like to do that with this function? You can just choose any of those methods, either before, let's see here. Let's see, React Lifecycle Methods.
I'd personally recommend DidMount instead of constructor.
Why would you recommend that?
So there's a possibility your component will finish rendering before your function returns, in which case the state won't get updated.
There's a possibility that it'll finish rendering before
your fetch request returns.
Yes, but if you call setState after your fetch function returns, then it'll re-render, right?
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. Oh, but I see what you mean. Like if you just wanted to, I see what you mean. If you put fetch inside of the constructor, because it's asynchronous, you can't just set the state inside of the constructor based on the result of fetch, because it's async and the render function will probably be called first. That's true. That's true. But yeah, but because we're calling setState at the end of it, it'll just re-render. So it's probably doesn't matter too much where we put it, as long as we put it in a place where it's only called once.
Gotcha. Okay, sounds good.
Cool. So I posted a link which has a list of the lifecycle methods. And based on our discussion, we probably want to use, let's see, either component DidMount or component, well, probably not, yeah, component will update. Oh, looks like that one is marked as unsafe and a legacy. So we probably don't want to use component will mount. So we could either, yeah, so we could either use component DidMount or constructor. Would anybody like to do that, to write that code?
Can you explain component will mount just like briefly?
Yeah. So component will mount basically it's called before, like right before the is inserted into the DOM. So like for example, let's go in here. Okay. So I'm going to go into, do I not have my React tools in this thing? Let me go to Chrome. Chrome window. Developer tools. Okay. So there should be exactly one component, React component in this application, which is called app. So I've got my React tools installed here. I'm just gonna drill down, and yes, I have one component called app. And that component has a couple of elements inside of it, like this div class name equals app. Okay, so if I go take a look at this thing, you see right here, div class equals app. This is my React component called app. And its parent is a div whose ID is called root. So mounting the app component basically means appending this child, this app component DOM element to the list of children of the root, this root DOM element. So like, for example, if I delete this guy, then I've just removed him from the DOM. That's basically what unmounting is. And mounting is when he gets added back into the DOM. So I just press Control Z, and that adds him back to the DOM. I could do this. This is equivalent to. So let me just save a reference to him. So this is equivalent to me doing. So see, this is the root node. Root node dot remove child. So that's the equivalent of unmounting, is removing the child from the DOM. And mounting is the equivalent of appending the child back into the DOM.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So let's go back here. So does that, would anybody like to create a constructor method for our app component? And then copy paste this fetch code into the constructor? Great. Yeah, keep going, give it some braces. Now you got to call super and pass in props. Yep, just like that. And that is invoking the superclass of app, which is component. And we're not going to go into detail about, superclasses and subclasses and things like that, but it's just important to know that the first line, the first statement of your constructor function, you have to invoke super, just like that. So, so that's all you need to know. Would you like to move the calls to fetch and the handler code into the constructor? You can just cut and paste it. Yeah, totally. Great. I'll just delete this guy. Oh, you don't need to invoke component DidMount. We only need it in one place. We would either call this in the constructor or in component DidMount. We could put it in either spot. For us, for this application, it's pretty much equivalent. Component DidMount is useful if you need to access the DOM node of this component. And sometimes you would need to access the DOM node if like you're using special DOM APIs. So what the heck does that mean? Well, like for example, if you are, say, like doing some things related to animation specifically, sometimes there are like special APIs on the DOM node where you'll need to access the DOM node in order to call those APIs. Let's see, just off the top of my head, I've got this website. If it's even still working. So it makes these cool little diagrams, and then you can interact with them. And so in order to do this kind of animation stuff, so this is all React. In order to do this kind of animation stuff, it basically does component DidMount, gets the DOM node, and then there are special APIs on those DOM nodes that it calls in order to trigger the animation on the SVG elements. So anyway, but we don't need to do anything with the DOM node of this component. We just need a place in the component which is going to get called once when the component is created, and only once, so that we only fetch the data once. Okay, cool. So we've moved the data retrieval into a better place. So now we want to handle that data better. Like now we've got the data coming in. So now we want to do something with this data so that we can retrieve the forecast and then render it nicely in a widget.
Jake, how do we know the data's coming in?
That's because of this line right here. We did a console.log, and then later we did an alert so that we were able to verify that it was coming in. Yep. So let's go back to what the data actually looked like so we know how to manipulate it. So we can see here that it has this properties object, and then below that it has a forecast with a URL. So if we want to retrieve the forecast, how would we, given this object, how would we go about doing that? It's similar to what we've already done. Sorry, I wasn't able to understand you because it was very choppy. Can you repeat that, or maybe type in the chat?
Hello?
Hi, can you hear me? Oh boy.
I don't think I've heard.
Sorry, I think it might be better to use the chat. Just a moment. Can anyone else hear Dakir, or is it just on my end?
I can't hear him either.
Okay.
But was the answer you were seeking, was that fetch? Are we fetching?
Yeah, totally.
Okay.
So you're going to want to call fetch, and you're going to want to pass it some data from, from that object O. Do you want to modify that code?
Well, I missed last night's lesson because I was at a conference, but is it similar to what you already have there with
Yeah.
that's right before super?
Yeah. It's that's right. Yeah.
Okay,
You
so,
just call fetch,
mhm.
and then you pass it O, and then you're gonna reference some of those properties on O.
Okay, let me see. I think I closed my REPL screen by accident. Let me just open it back up really quickly.
Sure, I can send you the link as well.
Okay, it was here somewhere. Hold on.
Do you need a state?
Not yet.
Mm.
Yeah, because the data that we need is available in the response that we got back, and it's in this object O.
Okay. So do you need a way to reference the data like this, or is that?
No, all you have to do is reference, like the data is contained in this object O,
Mm-hmm.
and all you have to do is reference O. You just have to like reference a couple of properties on O.
All right, so this is Dana again. So should I be starting right here above render?
You're gonna do it on line 12.
On line 12, okay.
Yeah, you can delete what's there.
All right, line 12, okay. So delete this, the alert JSON.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right, so. And then I have to go to the data. I have to go to the information, and I have to grab the URL, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right, let me go to that page. That is.
Oh, but you don't need to do it you don't need to actually go to the page, because the information is going to be on that variable O.
Oh, it's on the variable. Okay, so I'll come
Exactly.
back to the REPL.
Let me just paste what this object looks like.
Chrome.
I'll just paste it up above here
Okay.
so that we can,
I don't
as a
know
reference.
my REPL screen. That's so weird to me. Let me see. Go back here to Zoom. Oh, here it is. I think this is it. No, that's not it.
One sec, I'll paste the.
Oh, here it is. Okay. So, all right. So I have the fetch there. You said no URL. All right. So I'm looking at line 11, and I see that you have function O. Like I said, I'm not really sure.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Let me. I'll put it back.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So yeah, if you go to line 12.
Yes.
It's where it says alert JSON.stringify.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just delete that.
Yeah.
So if
on my screen, I've already deleted it. I think I'm having a problem with my connection to you. Someone else will probably need to type it. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Sorry.
It's not a perfect technology.
No.
I guess it's the best we've got.
Yeah.
Does anybody want to type that out?
Let's see.
Anybody want to call fetch? So remember, this is the type of object that we're
Okay, can you see
mhm.
my typing now?
I can't.
No. Okay. All right. I can see it on my screen, but apparently it's not updating on yours. So
Are you using Chrome?
I am using Chrome. I think it's just my Wi-Fi.
It's so strange.
Yeah.
Do you, uh, I was just looking it up. Do you need to set up a variable or declare a variable to set the data and assign the data to it? Is that?
You actually don't, because we have the data available. Like the data is in O. O is the object that was returned from the server. Like basically we called this API,
Mm-hmm.
and then we parsed the response as JSON. The server responded to us as a bunch of text. That text looked like this. And then we were able to parse that text into an object because the text was formatted as JSON.
Mm-hmm.
So O is that object. So we can now reference properties on that object. And in particular, we can reference the properties property. This property is confusingly named properties, but we can reference that. So we can say o.properties, and then we can reference the forecast property on the properties object. Say that 3 times fast.
Yeah, because they're mapping over the data, and then
Right.
they're using a return, and they're setting up a key sort of thing.
Yeah, you can just call, yeah, I mean, just the way that you have it right there, you can just say o.properties .forecast, and that'll give you what you need. Exactly. And then you can pass that into fetch. So you can call fetch, and you can pass that in as a parameter. That's almost correct. You just want to take the return and you want to move it to the outside. You just want to move the return to the left of fetch. Yeah. Yep, that's good. There you go. Okay, that's perfect. And
I'm just confused why we were using fetch twice. I've never used fetch twice in a row.
right. So it's because this forecast property, you all can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Great. So this forecast property is actually a URL, right? So so we call this, it's like we call this first API, and it gives us a list of URLs to get more information. So for example, it gives us a list of, it says you can go to this URL to get the forecast. You can go to this URL to get the hourly forecast. You can go to this URL to get a list of all of the observation stations nearby. So in order to get the forecast, we have to call fetch a second time to get.
Oh, okay. Okay, I get it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's like we're hopping from one API to another API. It's multiple API calls.
Okay.
So the interesting thing about this, though, is that because fetch returns a promise, and if you return a promise from a handler that's passed to then, it's gonna, the promise is gonna, the program is gonna wait for the promise to resolve before we go to the next .then handler. So anyway, that's, so now that we've called fetch a second time, what do we do after that? Like if we want to handle the response. Again, it's pretty similar to what we've already done. So I'll post the I'll post the link here. Great. So that's almost perfect. Now, there's one thing, one way that we can improve this. And let me show you what that is. Well, actually, let me ask this. So, so remember when I was teaching the module on asynchronous programming, and we were talking about the advantages, the relative advantages of promises versus callbacks? So like previously, the way that everybody did asynchronous programming with JavaScript was using callback functions. And in callback functions, you'd like have like handler functions inside of handler functions inside of handler functions. And you'd see it indenting in like this, you know, so your code would be like deeply indented with handler functions. Whereas with promises, it gives you this nice linear flow without the indentation. And this is actually really good for error handling. And we'll see that later, like how it simplifies error handling. So anyway, with that said, can anybody see how to improve this this code on lines 12 through 14? This code is correct, but we can make it even better. We can use promises better here. So because we're returning, because fetch returns a promise, and the .then function waits for the promise to resolve, and you can chain .then functions. Does anybody see what we could do? I'll just show you this one. So we can take this code and move it out to here, which is pretty nice. Because that means that if the fetch function on line 9 fails, or the fetch function on line 12 fails, we can handle it in one spot just by writing a .catch right here. And we can handle the error right there. And that's all just kind of magically taken care of for us by the promise mechanism. So anyway, and plus it avoids the deep indentations of handling callbacks. So anyway, that's okay. So presumably this worked. Would anybody like to test it to make sure that it worked? Do you remember how to do that? If you want to add another .then and a handler on line 15, we just want to do a console.log to check the response, to like check the output, to make sure that we're getting what we expect. Great. Okay, so we'll have to go over here to check that. Yeah, okay. So we can see that we're getting what we expect. It's another object with a properties property, and then a property called periods, and then which has a bunch of data which we can then render. So good. So we have the data that we want to render. So and it's right here on line 16. So now that we have this data that we want to render, what do we want to call if we want to take this data and then have our component force our component to re-render so that it can detect this data and then render the data? What method do we call on a React component when we want it to do that?
I mean,
Set
I'm
state.
just calling another render.
Yeah, you call set state. So would anybody like to call set state with this data on line 16? Any volunteers? It's okay if it's wrong. Yeah, that's looking good. You wanna invoke it. You don't need to assign to it. Yeah. So invoke it like a function. Yep, that's looking good. That's looking good. So we can name this data anything that we want. So maybe if you want to call it like weather periods, that would be inappropriate, or even just periods. Sure. And then you're going to want to assign that. So you're going to want to set periods equal to some data. Yeah, exactly. But you want to use a colon instead of an equal sign. Colon, not a semicolon. Yeah, exactly. Great. Okay, great. So so now we should have that data available to render in our application. So we can do that down here in render, in the render function. So so let's get rid of all of this. And does anybody remember how to render data in a component? Yep. Good. Yeah, good. Okay, it's just complaining about this. Just get rid of that. So there's one other. So there's one other issue. Let's see if it's complaining about it. I think it is. Yes. Right. Good. Okay. So so it's complaining that state is null. Okay. So there are two problems here that I see. Okay. So the first one is you can see there's an error. It says it cannot read property periods of null, and that's because right now the state is set to null by default. So we have to initialize the state in the constructor. So I'm just going to set this.state equals periods null. So that should prevent it from, let's see, line 8. Expected an assignment or function expression. Why are they complaining about that? Oh, okay. All right. So that was one error that it was encountering. The other error, so now if we set a breakpoint here, I think this part is also probably throwing an error. Oh yeah, I'm sure it is. It's just catching the error and we aren't handling it, which is why it's not telling us. Console.error E. So the other error that's happening is this is going to be undefined. And that's because we're using this kind of syntax to declare the anonymous function. There are two different ways to declare an anonymous function handler. And kind of an old way and a new way. So this is the old way, and it doesn't remember, it doesn't capture the this object. You lose the this object when you declare a function handler like this. So the new way is to do it like this, and that will capture the this object. And you pretty much always want to do that. There's not really any disadvantage that I know of to using the fat arrow syntax, is what it's called. And it'll prevent you from, losing this object. It's like 99% of the time the behavior that you want. So, and it's also shorter. So probably better just to use the fat arrow syntax. So let's see if this is going to work now. So we have this.setState. Okay, that's looking good. Oh, there's another issue. Okay, so it doesn't like the fact that we're passing in an object as a React child. So it wants us to break this down a little bit. So let's break this down so that we just give it some property so that we know, so that we can just test that it's working. So we'll just give it something. So it has this property called type. So we're just going to start with that. This.state.periods.type. Just to make sure that it's fetching data and able to render it. We'll do something more interesting after. Oh, that's also throwing an error because periods might not be defined. So we have to do it like this. This.state.periods and this.state.periods.type. I think this, is it gonna work? Yeah, okay. So it rendered feature. Not very exciting yet, but it's a start. Okay, let's break for 5 minutes, and then we can pick this up. We can pick this up after that. Does that work for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, I will see you back here at 6:50. Okay, thank you. Is everybody here? Do we have a quorum?
It's Eva, I'm here.
Okay. Okay, let's get back to it. So we've been able to fetch the data that we want and then render a very small piece of it. So let's take another look at this data and see if we can understand it, and then see if we can render it in a way that looks nice and aesthetically pleasing. So, so we got our forecast. It has a properties property. Then inside of it, it has a periods property, which is an array. And then each one of these periods is a forecast for some time, which is coming up. And it looks like it's ordered sequentially. So in order of, like chronologically, basically. So it looks like we don't need to sort it. And we can probably just loop through the periods and render each one of these objects. So we probably want to render it so that each one of these properties is a row in a table. And the whole widget, the whole forecast widget, can fit inside of one table. And yeah, each one of these properties would be a row. And then each period could be a column. So that it's, you know, we have one column for this afternoon, we have one column for tonight, we have one column for Wednesday, and so on. I think that's the way most weather forecasts look. I mean, let's see here. 10-day forecast. NYC. Yeah, so that seems about right. So you have one column for each period. Seems to be the right way to do it. And then you have a row for the icons and a row for the temperature. This is the high, this is the low. So that seems like about the right way to render this data. So so let's just copy this so that we have an example nearby that we can refer to. And let's create a new component to render this widget. So let's create a new file for it. Let's call it, whoops, put it in source. Call it weather component.js. And we're gonna make this what's called a pure component, which means that it doesn't have any state. All of its state gets passed in to it, and it never calls set state. So the way that you do that is, did you guys talk about pure components last week?
I don't think so.
there's a shorthand way to do that. So like there are two different ways to declare components in React. The first one is like this. You use the class. You basically can create a new class that extends component. That's one way you can do it. The other way that you can do it is you can do it like this. You can say const weather component is equal to that. And then you pass in the properties, just like this. And this is exactly the same thing as declaring a function. Like you're literally just declaring a function. But this function is interpreted as a component. It gets rendered as a component. Feel free to interrupt me if any of this is not clear. We're going to continue building this as we go along. So okay. So we want to pass it some props, right? So like basically we want to pass it this periods object, right? So does anybody remember how to import a component? Yeah, good. Now this just needs this. And apparently I declared this incorrectly. What doesn't it like? Do it like this. Yeah, good. Okay. And we'll pass it in. We'll say weather component periods is equal to this dot state dot periods. We'll have this return just the length right now, just so that we can make sure that it's giving us what we expect. Props.length. Oh, and we have to import React. Oh, yeah, this is.
Instead of a class here.
It has to do props.periods.length. That should work. Just turning up blank. Wonder why. Let's see here. Weather component. let's see, props dot periods. Oh, it's because we're passing it in the wrong thing. Right.
Is that your dog?
Properties.
Oh, that's me. Sorry.
Okay, this should work. Yeah, props.periods.length. Okay, 14. Good. Okay, so we have our weather component. We're passing in data to it. And now we want to render that data as a table. So that each, let me grab this. Right, so that each one of these properties, and so this is basically, this is a period, right? We want each one of these properties to be a row, and we want each period to be a column. So, so we need to write the logic to render that. Does anybody have a good sense of how to get started with that? Yeah, I mean that seems about right. Do you want to type that out as JSX? Seems like a good place to get started. Nice. Okay. So now we want to do some iterating. We basically want to iterate through each of the keys of the period object. So I'm actually going to help out a little bit here. So we are going to create a bunch of little components for each one of these properties, so that we're able to render each one of them in a special way. And I'll show you why we want to do that. Actually, I'm just going to put this into an editor because it'll go a little bit faster. Okay. So, right. So for the name row, actually, we'll just do this one by one. We'll do it in the browser. We'll name each one of these things. Okay. So we do name component, name row component. Takes a name property and just returns the name property. It's pretty easy. We can skip showing whether it's daytime. We want to render the temperature. So that involves a couple of properties, these two properties, temperature and temperature unit. So call this temperature row component. Which takes the temperature and the temperature unit, and then returns a template string, temperature and temperature unit, and then a degree symbol. Temperature trend is null, so we'll just ignore that. Wind speed row component is equal to wind speed. We'll just return that as well. Same thing for wind direction. And we'll do the icon. And this guy will be an image whose source is equal to the icon. We'll just skip the other ones. And we'll create an array called row components. And the idea is that we can iterate through each one of these components and make it a row. So that each one of these guys gets to live in its own row. So does anybody remember how to iterate through an array in React? Can do it right here on line 46. Can anybody iterate through row components?
I don't really know how to do it in React, but like I was thinking of like a for loop, like a for each. but
Yeah. So in React, the way that you do it is the easiest way to do it is using map, call map. And because we're iterating through a component, like through a bunch of components, we want to render them, then we can just call each component like this. So this C corresponds to one of these components. And we basically want to pass each one of them the same data, which is the oh, sorry, I got a bit ahead. So so yeah, we want to create a row for each one of these components that corresponds to a property of the data that we're getting back, property of the forecast. And then we want to do the columns. And each column is going to be one of the weather periods. So so that's just this props object. Sorry, just a moment. It's props.periods. So we'll turn this into periods like this. So using the same technique that we used on line 46, can you iterate through can you iterate through periods using the map object and create a TD?
like this,
Yep.
and then what do
And
I?
then you got a function.
What do I pass it though?
It's going to be one of these weather periods, so you can probably just call it period.
Oh, you just made it up.
Yeah. You can name the variable whatever you like.
Okay, and then do I have to do this like fat thing?
Yep. Fat arrow syntax.
Sorry, and then
That's okay.
you want TDs.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the one thing that you need to do is you need to put wrap it in parentheses. Yeah. Because otherwise the arrow syntax doesn't, well, the way the arrow syntax works is it will return, if you don't use braces, the curly brackets, it'll return whatever is on the right side of it, which is a very like terse, convenient syntax. You don't have to write a lot of code. But it also, I believe it also doesn't understand new lines unless you add a parentheses to the right. So anyway, that's the way that you do that. Okay, so that's looking good. Let me just fix what's happening up above here so that it stops complaining. Alt equals icon. Okay. So then, okay. So now what I'm about to do, this is an advanced React topic. It's called higher order components. I'm just going to plug it in and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So C. And then period. believe that works. Period is not defined. That's strange because I believe it's defined right here. Maybe it was like this. No, it doesn't like that. Okay, one moment. I'm just going to refer to the code example that I typed up, just to remind myself of how to do that syntax. Oh yeah, no, that looks correct. Did I misspell it? That looks good. Does it need to be like this? No. It's peculiar. I'll change it. P is not defined. Line 50. Oh, my bad. We have to evaluate all of this as code.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, now we're good. All right, so let's make sure that this works, and then let's talk about what's happening here. Okay, good. That's looking good. See, it's not rendering this degree symbol. I think we can fix that if we wrap this in a div. Or even better yet, a span. Let me pop this window back in as well. Oops. Oh, I just refreshed the page. All right, well, that didn't quite do. Well, I mean, there's another way to do this as well, I think. Div, and then rather than using a template string, we just do span. Yeah, that's better. Span. This guy needs to be evaluated. Okay, good. All right, so now we've got a nice little weather widget. So what was happening in this spot? You might be wondering. What's happening here, so this is what's called a higher order component. And basically what that is it's when you assign a component to a variable and you start to pass components around as arguments to functions. So that's what's happening here. It's like we're iterating through an array of components, and then each of those components gets assigned to a variable, which is C, for each iteration. we create a new table row. We go through each one of the periods, and then we basically pass that period as properties to that component. And the reason why we set things up that way was so that we could handle each one of these components the same. You can see here that we didn't have to write any special code to handle these, each one of these rows. We were just able to like throw the period into the component, and then the component was just able to pull out the properties that it needed and then render whatever it needed for each one of those periods. Is that pretty clear? Or is that like very confusing? On a scale of 1 to 10, how, how clear is it?
Definitely
Well,
up.
sorry?
It's definitely like higher level than.
Yeah, it's more advanced. But the reason why we did it this way was because, you know, it creates a very small amount of code. This is probably the most minimal way to represent this and do this kind of rendering.
I mean, it's definitely easier than calling.
Sorry, what were you saying?
Oh, sorry. I didn't know if like I was muted. I said it's definitely easier than calling each one like individually. So like putting them in the array and then using the spread operator that's cool.
Right. The alternative would have basically been to like have, you know, special code for each one of these things and pull out the properties that we needed here and reference each one here.
I think it's easier to follow like visually as well. Like, you know, if you have to look back at it.
Yeah, I think it's the smallest way to represent this. So, so anyway, that's the coding exercise. We've done it. We've achieved it. We've written a small weather widget, fetched some data from the weather service. Oh, there is one other thing that we could do, which might be interesting, which is instead of hard coding this latitude and longitude, we could use the browser to fetch the user's position, because the browser has a geo API. So I'll just show you how to do that quickly. It's not very different than what we've done so far. So it uses this navigator.geolocation.getCurrentPosition. And this uses a callback-based API. And this is how you turn that callback-based API into a promise-based one. So we can just modify that quickly. And then we create a new fetch handler and pass in this call to fetch here and grab the position. and turn this guy into a template string. And we say position.chords dot latitude and comma position.chords dot longitude. And we have to return this because fetch returns a promise. And it should, let me open this in a new tab. Let's see. Well, I think it's, oh, no. Well, okay, if it's the first time that you've run it, it should ask you for permission for your location, to get your location. But because I've done it before, it already asked me, so it just remembered. So I was able to look up the forecast for, well, for me, for New York City. It looks like we've got a 50% chance of rain here, and 65 degrees, which is a lot cooler than it has been. Tomorrow is going to be 81 and sunny. So if you want to refresh this and check what the forecast is going to be for Syracuse, you might want to do that.
Yeah, that worked. That was cool.
Great. So that's one of the capabilities that you have building modern browser applications, is you can get the user's location and feed it into APIs and get data based on their location. So we just built a little weather application. So with that said, I'm gonna dive into some, unless anybody has any questions right now, I'm gonna dive into, I just have a couple of slides. We're gonna write some simple tests for this application, using what are called snapshot tests for React. And we're gonna start with by writing a couple of those tests, so you can see how snapshot tests work for testing React components. Unless anybody has any questions before I get started on that.
Okay, where is the code for the weather component file?
In REPL.it.
Yeah, I only see the,
it's at the bottom right here. It's weather-component.
oh, okay, sorry. All right.
No worries. Yeah. And also all of this stuff is posted on GitHub.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll repost the link right now.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Okay, so let's dive into the slides. So we talked a little bit about snapshot tests yesterday. And the idea behind snapshot tests is it's a very quick and easy way to make sure that your components don't change unexpectedly. It's what they call zero configuration. We'll see what that means in a second, but basically it's like you just flip a switch and it captures snapshots of your application, and then later on, it'll take those components, it'll pass them the same props, and it'll just check to make sure that it renders the same. That's all it does. But it's so quick to develop these things that it's a very popular approach, because it's really close to zero cost to create snapshot tests. But they're also a little bit dangerous for the following reasons. you really need a code review process in place to maintain them because they're so easy to create and to update. Like you aren't really editing the snapshot file by hand. It's sort of automatically generated. And whenever something, you know, if the snapshot breaks, the easiest thing to do is to just regenerate it. So that means that you really need somebody to like be watching for changes in these snapshots to make sure that you're expecting them to change. Also, snapshots can capture potentially too much information. So if you're like capturing, if you have a component which is rendering a bunch of subcomponents, it's not necessarily helpful to have it, have the snapshot capture all of those subcomponents and get snapshots of all of those. Because if the subcomponent changes, you may not want the snapshot test for the parent component to fail. Or maybe you do. I mean, these are questions that you have to ask with this type of approach to testing. Probably the main thing to be concerned about with snapshot tests is it doesn't express the developer's intent. So with unit tests, you're explicitly thinking about the boundary conditions of the function that you're testing. And you're testing it for failure and success, and you really need to think about and reason about what it is that you should be testing when you're doing unit testing. With snapshot tests, it basically just captures a snapshot and it says, is this thing the same? And if it is, then you're good. But if it's not, then then the test fails and you don't really know why. And you don't know if it was intentional or not intentional. So it can create confusion. And the last issue is that it's not for test-driven development. You can't really do test-driven development with snapshot tests. The reason why is in order to create a snapshot, you need to have written the component already. So you can't write the test before writing the component, which is the idea behind test-driven development. So those are the disadvantages of snapshot tests, but the advantages potentially outweigh them, at least in many practical contexts. So, so the advantage to snapshot testing is that it's similar to taking a visual screenshot and then comparing it later on to, you know, taking a new screenshot and making sure that the screenshots are the same, except that it's better than a screenshot because you're not dealing with any kind of like flakiness around like browsers and like whether you can load it and whether it is going to look the same and, you know, whether the network might fail or something like that. It's much faster and more robust than doing traditional kind of testing where you might be taking screenshots and comparing screenshots. So it's an incremental improvement over that. And yeah, they're basically just a really quick way of capturing the state of the UI as it is, given certain parameters, and making sure that that is rendering the same going forward and that nothing changes. So it's really good for testing user interfaces if your user interface isn't changing that much. And it's good for behavior that doesn't necessarily have like a clear definition. So those are all the slides, and we can proceed to writing some snapshot tests for this application. So I'll show you how that works. I don't think that I can run that in REPL.it. I don't think REPL.it has that capability. Let's see. I certainly haven't tried that. Let's see, you can install packages. But to do this, you really need a CLI. You really need a command line interface. And we kind of have one right here, but it looks like it's only doing one thing. Yeah. No. So I'm just going to do it. I'm just going to do it in my console, and if you like, you can follow along. Don't know if I can git clone this guy either. So I'm just gonna clone my existing repo. Oh, okay. Can everybody see my screen pretty well?
Yes.
I know I'm in the dark right now. 1 second. I don't know how important it is that you see my face, but let's turn that on. Okay. All right. Okay, so if you've created your React application using create React app, actually I have some instructions here. Nope, that's not it. Getting started. Sorry, just a moment. I've misplaced the documentation. Which I believe was yeah, okay, here it is. Sorry about that. So yeah, basically to do snapshot testing in your React project created with create React app, you call yarn add or npm add React test renderer. And then all you have to do is just run npm run test. So just a moment. So you typically will create your snapshot tests inside of the tests directory. You'll create a directory right next to your modules called __tests__. This is a convention. And this is where you can write your tests. And you can see I have a test here called weather.test.js. And I've imported the weather component and this thing called renderer from React Test Renderer. And what that renderer is doing is it's basically rendering the component, but instead of rendering it inside of the browser, it's just rendering it in sort of like a headless environment where it's able to just capture the state of that component and just capture that snapshot. And I also have some mock data, which has the this periods object, which I captured from NOAA, from the API. So I've saved that to a file. And then I'm loading that as well, because I'm going to pass that data to the component. Because if you remember, the component takes a prop called periods, so we want to pass that data into the component. So basically we want to, like, whatever component you're testing, you want mock data for it, and then you just pass that mock data into it so that it has whatever it needs in order to render. So, so we captured that mock data, saved it to a file, loaded it, and then you write your tests like this. Test, and then the name of the test, and then a test handler. And the basic way you do a snapshot test is you call renderer.create, and you pass in the component, like this weather component. And well, here I guess I named the prop forecast instead of periods in my original implementation. But anyway, you pass in the data that it needs to render, and then that creates the component. And then you say component.toJSON, and that basically turns it into a tree. And then you say expect the tree dot toMatch snapshot. Now, if the snapshot doesn't exist, Jest, which is the test runner, will actually create the snapshot for you. And it saves that in a directory inside of tests called __snapshots __. And it'll save the snapshot into a file. And you can see it looks like a big blob of HTML and text. And that's what it's going to use to look up the results of the snapshot test. That's what it's using to look up the expected value. So if you're running this for the first time, it's going to generate that snapshot. So okay, so this is these are a lot of words. Let me show you how this actually works. Okay, so let me remove the file in the snapshot directory so that we've got a clean slate. And I actually have two tests in the snapshot tests. So I'm just going to comment out one of them. So we're just running one of them. So we're going to test our weather component. Now, if I've created my application using create React app, then all I have to do is run npm run test. And it says command not found because I haven't done npm install yet. Actually, I think I'll just do yarn install. Oh, there's nothing more exciting than watching somebody's packages get installed. I'm just going to go into the directory where I actually have this running. Okay. And I will similarly remove the tests. The snapshot that I've saved. And comment out that one test that we will come back to in a moment. Okay, so I'm going to do npm run test. You can see what it does. So you can see it's running this React scripts test, and that React scripts test is the thing that calls jest. And okay, you can see it's running it now, and it ran it, and it said test suites, 1 passed, 1 total. Ran all test suites related to changed files. Okay, cool. That's good. Now let's see what happens if, actually let me go into tmux. Okay. Now, one interesting thing about this is that the test script is actually going to run continuously. So if I change the React component, it will actually rerun the tests automatically. So let me do that. So let's say I change, okay, so first let me go into tests, snapshots, and you can see that it's captured this weather snapshot for the weather component. Now, if I go and I change that weather component, so that it, I add another div and I say, div, this is broken, it's going to catch that and complain. Yeah, so it just complained about that. It says 1 snapshot failed from 1 test suite. Inspect your code changes or press U to update them. And it goes and it shows me where in the snapshot, it gives me what's called a diff. And it shows me where in the snapshot, what changed in the snapshot. Points it out and it says this is broken. But you can see that that took no time at all to capture a snapshot and to detect that something had changed. And if I wasn't expecting that change, then this would be a really quick and easy kind of early warning system. So, and it's one that can run continually alongside your code as you're coding. So I'll go ahead and press U to update that snapshot. So it should be updating it now. Okay, it says 2 passed. That's good. If I go back and I change it again, it should detect the change and, yeah, tell me that it broke again, which it did. So I'll set it back. So, okay, that's a basic tutorial on how to do snapshot testing. Does, with Create React App. Does anybody have any questions on that? So if there are no questions, there's one other thing which I'd like to show you, which is mocking. So mocking does not mean to make fun of something. Instead, it means to basically, it's kind of like mocking in the sense of a mockingbird. It's to emulate something, even though it's not the real thing. And this is useful for when you're doing, well, for applications like this weather application, where you want to test to make sure that things are rendering in the way that you expect, but you don't necessarily always want to go and hit the Weather API to run your tests. And the reason why is because the Weather API is not something that you have control over. It's, you know, the government is in charge of it, and it might have outages, it might have errors. Also, the weather is always going to change. So you're never going to get the same data back every time. So for that reason, if we want to test our component that's calling some API, it's important that we are able to mock that API call. So, so in order to do that, what I did was take that chunk of code. Here, we can do this together in REPL.it. Take this chunk of code, which we use to check the weather for the user's current location, and break this out into a new module called fetch weather. And say const fetch weather return. And we just have to take these last two guys. And move them here. Oh, and I forgot. If we get an error in the error handler of the promise, we just want to set the state and say that there was an error, just like that, so that we can show the user that down here, which which we'll do in a moment. Okay. Oh, looks like there's an error. There. Good. Okay. Now, this function is the one that is going to this, it's making the call to the API. So because we've broken out this function into its own function and its own module, if we want to avoid the API call and just mock that function, and mock the API call, all we have to do is mock the function, which basically means write a small replacement for the function that returns similar data. So the way that we can do that is we create a folder called _ mocks. So again, this is a jest convention. Jest is the test runner, which seems to be the most popular test runner for React right now. I think it's a Facebook project, which React also is. Go to fetch weather. And we basically create a module with the same name as the module that we want to mock inside of _ mocks. And then in order to load the mock module, and you can see what's happening in here, is that it's just loading up the mock data that we downloaded from the server. And it's creating a new promise. It's returning a promise, just like the real function that we have does, the same interface. So it returns a promise, and then it resolves the promise with that mock data that we saved from the server. And then in order to load that mock, we say, we use this call, we say jest.mock, and then we specify the path to the module that we want to mock. And then Jest does the rest for us. So what that allows us to do is when we have a component which is using that function, the function fetch weather for current location in our fetch weather module, instead of using the real function, it's going to use the mock function, which doesn't go to the network and returns the same data every time. So that way we can test, we can, for example, do a snapshot test to make sure that this component is going to render the same, given the same data, but we're going to prevent it from making a network call. And I can run that now and just make sure that that works. Let's do all. Okay, and it looks like that worked. I can do the same thing as before, where where I can go and change the rendering. Well, you saw that. You understand how snapshot tests work now. But I could change the, well, anyway, you understand. So does anybody have any questions about that, snapshot tests and mocking? Cool. So there's one more thing that I wanted to show you. This is not really related to testing per se, but it is related to software quality, which particularly when you're writing React applications. So did you guys go over prop types last week? Any mention of prop types?
We did not go over those.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about prop types quickly. So prop types is basically a way of defining your the APIs of your React components. So it's a way for you to basically declare for each React component, here's the type of data that I expect to receive. And if it doesn't receive that type of data, it'll complain about it. So it's basically a way of like defining the shape of your data, and then it gets checked at runtime, like when you're running the application, to make sure it matches your assumptions. So this is a really nice thing to do when you're developing your React components. So let's just look up how to do this. Right. So basically we do it like this. You import prop types, and then there are a number of ways that you can, so this is an example of how you use prop types. You declare your component up here, and then you say my component.prop types, and then there are a number of properties that you can specify, a number of ways that you can specify the type of data that your component expects to receive. We won't go through all of these. Let's just apply it to our weather component example. Okay, so we're going to import prop types. Okay. We're going to say weather component dot prop types is equal to, and we only expect it to receive one prop type, which is this periods, which is an array. So we use prop types dot array. So that should work. Let's just make it complain right now. Let's say that it's a number. Let's see what it does. Oh, it looks like I might have broken something before, unrelated to prop types. One moment, let me just fix that. This. Okay, good, that's working. Oh. Okay, so it'll give you some feedback. It'll say failed prop type, invalid prop periods of type array supplied to weather component, expected number. So it gives you feedback that you can use to validate your assumptions about the data which is getting passed through your application. So here I can say prop types.array, and it should take that. And yeah, it likes that. I believe you can even specify, yeah, you can say array of, and go even deeper into it if you want. So for example, we could say prop types dot array of, and then you can specify the shape of an object, which is, I mean, it's what you might call a schema for that object. It's basically the properties that you expect that object to have. So we can do that. Or you can specify exactly the properties that you expect an object to have. So if it has extra properties, then you give a warning. So let's try to define this. Prop types.shape, and we'll take these guys up here and convert each one of these properties into a prop type. So we can say prop types dot number prop types string, start time and end time are also technically strings, although we're not using them, so we'll just ignore those. Well, and so on. I think you get the idea. So it should go inside. It should go inside and validate the array as we pass it through. So it didn't complain about that, but if we changed name to a number prop type, I think it will probably complain about that. Yes, it says failed prop type, invalid prop period 0 dot name of type string supplied to weather component expected number. So so this is very handy because it will check your data to make sure that your data matches your assumptions. And this is pretty commonly used. You can write custom validation logic if you want to. And if you want to validate something really crazy, like for example, if we wanted to validate the start and end time strings. I'm trying to think about how we would do that. Well, anybody want to do a refresher on regular expressions? I mean, we could do that just for fun, just to close out today's lesson. So if we wanted to do a custom validator for the start time and end time properties, here's how we would do it. Okay, so you can see here that they're already using regular expressions inside of the prop type custom prop validator. So let's create a regular expression for this type of string. Does anybody feel like dusting off their knowledge of regular expressions? Anybody want to give it a try?
I've reached overload.
Yeah, fair enough.
That's just me though.
Here's how you could do it. Do this. Or something like that. T. You know, something probably kind of like that. Line 77. Okay. So that passes, but if we change the regular expression in a way so that maybe it takes you know, expects a letter at the end of it instead of a number, then it complains about that. It says invalid prop start time supplied to weather component, validation failed. So prop types is pretty flexible and useful way to guarantee that you're passing the data that you expect to, and you should use it when you're designing your React components. Okay, well, if does anybody have any questions?
Tomorrow,
Yeah.
can we do like a quick review of all the tests again?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, we can do that at the beginning of class. And yeah, for Thursday, I'd like that to be an all-day lab where we really just focus on, you know, your capstone projects as much as possible. I mean, obviously, I don't expect things to necessarily have progressed a lot since Monday, but yeah, if we could you know, talk about some different ways that you could potentially test your capstone projects, and then we could actually do some of that testing in class on Thursday. Yeah, I think that's what I'd like to do on Thursday. So yeah, if nobody has any further questions, I think we can wrap up now. If you do think of any questions, feel free to hit me up on Slack.
You.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jake.
Thanks. Bye.